Hi, everyone. My name is Jennifer Ames, and I'm a researcher at the Division of Research at Kaiser Permanente, Northern California. I am a white woman in her mid-30s, and I have brown hair. Today, I'm going to present on a project called Reproductive Health and Obstetrics Gynecology Healthcare Use in Autistic Adults as part of the AIR-P Research Day at Autism Cares 2022. So we were motivated to study this topic because adults with disabilities often have less access to reproductive and sexual health resources than adults without disabilities. Furthermore, autistic adults may experience additional barriers because of sensory and communication differences and low provider awareness of autism. There's also evidence that suggests autistic adults may be at a higher risk of menstrual-related conditions, including negative experiences with pain and emotion and behavior. So for this study, we drew our sample from the membership of Kaiser Permanente Northern California, which is a large healthcare system. And we specifically focused on adults who were assigned female at birth and who fell into 3 study groups. The first were people who had a diagnosis of autism. The second group were people who had diagnoses of other developmental disabilities, such as cerebral palsy and intellectual disability. And the third group had neurotypical development and didn't have diagnoses of autism or diagnoses of other developmental disabilities. And among these groups, we examined their use of reproductive healthcare services during a 2-year period, 2017 to 2019. So we looked at whether they visited their gynecologist, also known as an OBGYN provider, and whether they received screenings for cervical and breast cancer. And we looked at different types of hormonal contraception use, like birth control pills. And we also looked at reproductive health diagnoses like menstrual conditions. And we compared these variables across our autistic, other developmental disabilities, and neurotypical groups. So these are our results. These are bar graphs comparing the prevalence of medical diagnoses among autistic adults, shown in purple, adults with other developmental disabilities, shown in a salmon color, and neurotypical adults in a gold color. And on the left, we see that the prevalence of menstrual conditions were generally similar across all the groups, between 20 to 25%. However, in the middle, the prevalence of polycystic ovary syndrome, PCOS, tended to be higher in the autism and other developmental disability groups after taking into account factors like age, race, ethnicity, and insurance payer. And then on the right, sexually transmitted infections tended to be most prevalent among the neurotypical group compared to the other groups. So this slide is more bar graphs, but this time showing the prevalence of different types of reproductive health care. So the graph on the left shows that adults with autism and other developmental disabilities were less likely to visit the OBGYN than the neurotypical group. These 2 groups, autism and other developmental disabilities, were also less likely than the neurotypical group to receive a cervical cancer screening between the ages of 21 to 65 and to receive a mammogram, which is the recommended screening for breast cancer after age 40. So this slide is showing the bar graphs again of the OBGYN visits and cervical cancer screenings, but this time split out by age groups. And what is demonstrated is that the disparity, the differences between the groups in these reproductive health services is largest among adults who are in their early adulthood, in their 20s and 30s. And this slide is a table with a lot of numbers. And it's reporting the prevalence of hormonal contraceptive use across the groups and also the adjusted risk ratios comparing use across our autism, other developmental disabilities, and neurotypical groups. And the takeaway here is that both the autism and developmental disability groups were less likely than the neurotypical group to use hormonal contraception overall. However, these two groups were more likely to use oral contraceptives for therapeutic purposes specifically, and also they were more likely to use injectable forms of contraception like Depo-Provera compared to the neurotypical group. However, the neurotypical group was most likely to use intrauterine devices, IUDs. So in discussion, what we found was that in comparison to neurotypical adults, autistic adults and adults with other developmental disabilities had lower utilization of multiple types of reproductive health care services. And we saw that these care disparities tended to emerge early in adulthood, suggesting that the transition to adulthood may be a critical period for further research. So in terms of implications, these disparities that we're seeing have implications for long-term health and may relate to potential delays in cervical and breast cancer detection and treatment. It's also important to note that these findings reflect care in an integrated healthcare system that has strong outreach programs for preventive care. So we might expect that the disparities that we're seeing would be even larger in the broader US population, where people may have less access to healthcare. For future directions, it will be important to follow up these findings with qualitative interviews to better understand patient experiences and barriers to healthcare access. And I just want to acknowledge my co-authors on this slide and our funding. Thank you very much. And the questions for feedback are, how can we better understand the patient, provider, and system level factors that contribute to these disparities? What can be done to address these disparities? And the last question, are there examples of OBGYN clinics that specialize in neurodivergent care, and what can we learn from them? Thank you.